Okay, we may as well get started right on time here. It's great to see so many people here in the middle of Saturday morning after we're all exhausted and Minneapolis beckons and there are planes to catch and all that. So thank you for being here. We have a large cast today. Just in case there's any doubt, this is the session, Let's Talk About Open Images and Your Museum. And if you read the description, you'll know that by the time we get a third or a half of the way into our hour, we'll really open it up for conversation. So it'll be great as we launch into the presentational part, if you can all be thinking of either questions or tales of obstacles you're encountering or tales of how you have worked through or passed obstacles in launching this sort of program yourself, because that's what we'll be doing in a very open-ended way. Before very long at all. The cast today, we have Melissa Fournier from the Yale Center for British Art, Merete Sanderhoff from the National Gallery of Denmark, Alan Newman from the National Gallery of Art, me, Rob Lancefield from the Davison Art Center at Wesleyan University, Stanley Smith from the J. Paul Getty Museum, and Gray Bowman from the Indianapolis Museum of Art. We're going to start off with a really short introduction to the general topic, as in super short, figuring that the broad notion of what we're talking about here is probably familiar to most of you. And then we'll launch into 2-minute or so sort of micro talks about how each of our museums found its way towards being able to do it. So for the purposes of this session, we'll be using open images, open access images, and open content as synonyms for publicly provided images of museum collection objects that are themselves in the public domain, with no fees and no museum-imposed restrictions on those images used by anyone in any way, non-commercial or commercial, really just putting the stuff out there. The details of these policies can vary from museum to museum, but they all reflect one shared underlying principle, which is that if a suitable image represents an object that isn't burdened by third-party rights, the museum making it available doesn't assert control over the use of that image by adding a layer of rights claims or by enforcing any contract-based restrictions or fees. Various sessions at past conferences in the last 3 or 4 years have focused on open access policies themselves, or on technical implementation of delivering open images, or on how people are using them. And in that last regard, most recently, Adrian Kingston has a great presentation from Museums in the Web Asia last month, which I'd recommend highly, which, among other things, talks about some of the Getty's work. So today, without rehashing any of that, we will focus on how open content policies can gain traction within museums. Unlike the many kinds of initiatives that we're probably all familiar with in various ways, where it can typically be better to ask forgiveness if it proves to be needed, rather than doing advance work on permission up front, launching an open images program typically does necessarily involve seeking advance approval from various kinds of high-level stakeholders, sometimes up to the very top, because it typically proves to be a very visible, public-facing sort of initiative. And it also proves to be the kind of program that once it's in place, you really can't walk it back, at least not in any remotely sane way. Once you've said to the world, those who are listening, we're giving this stuff away, and some people have started downloading it and using it for things, you can't claw it back. And you can't really say, well, no, we're not going to do that anymore because the person who did it didn't really have authorization from the institution to do it. So this is one of those pockets of activity where it typically takes some advanced groundwork with other folks under your same roof before it can go live. There may be exceptions to that, and if anybody can speak to those later on, that could be interesting to hear about too. So after we tell brief tales about how we gained some traction for our for these policies in our own museums, we will open it out. We should have 30 or 40 minutes for talking about your ideas, concerns, obstacles. As we do that, well, in advance of doing that, let me say, please be thinking of things to contribute to that. That piece of the session really will be as interesting as we all make it together. So, moving on to the micro presentation bit of this, because some of our tales of how things worked in each of our own institutions will probably invoke as local context for those moments what some slightly earlier programs had done, we'll talk briefly in order of when this particular selection of 6 folks were involved in launching these policies. I should say as a sidebar that there is no notion that the 6 of us here represent like the museums that did this first. We're a sort of a convenient tactical selection of some folks in places who did, but there were other very visible leaders in this, the Los Angeles County Museum of Art for one, Rijksmuseum, people who aren't at this particular table. So our little narrative sequence isn't a complete story, but it's some points along the way. The sequence for that will be Yale, the National Gallery of Denmark, the National Gallery in Washington, the Davison Art Center at Wesleyan, the Getty, and the IMA, Indianapolis Museum of Art. And each of us will zip through 4 things. What our open images policy is, when it was published and implemented, how easy or how troubled the path to launching it was, and how we moved past any obstacles that we ran into along the way to build buy-in or consensus, or perhaps avoided obstacles popping up by doing some of that work before making the ask official. So, stepping back to 2011, here's Melissa Fournier from the Yale Center for British Art.
Hi. So, Yale University's policy on open access to digital representations of works in the public. Sorry about that. Okay, so Yale University's policy on open access to digital representations of works in the public domain was announced in 2011. Yale's policy is not limited to scholarly or nonprofit use, not restricted to a selected number of works, and not restricted to limits on size or print run. So at its launch, a policy this broad was unique among U.S. cultural heritage institutions. Long before this launch, the art museums at Yale were eager to reduce barriers to image use, and we'd already discussed how to offer images free of charge. So in 2008, the directors of the Yale Museum, Library, and Archive collections were brought together to serve on the advisory board of the Office of Digital Assets and Infrastructure. After extensive discussions between the advisory board and the university administration, the idea of an open access policy was recommended to the university. The directors together recognized the role open access to images of their material could and should play in the university's mission. A memo in support of the policy was issued in the fall of 2010, which led to its endorsement in 2011. For our part, the center was fortunate that the development of the policy coincided with that of our online collection. From the start, we planned for unimpeded and automated delivery of open images. This mitigated the strain on resources that the rollout of the policy might have caused. However, we found that giving things away is sometimes not quite as easy as it sounds. At the center, we continually work to make the implementation of our policy more easily understood. For instance, when users ask us for permission, even when they don't need to, why? When users contact us to obtain a copy of, whoops, missed a slide here. When users contact us to get a copy of an image that they could easily download straight from our site, why? Yale's collection departments are diverse, and the policy allows for some differences, and this can be confusing to outside users. To harmonize approaches where possible, an open access implementation working group with members from the museums, library, and general counsel of Yale was formed in 2011, and we met regularly for the next year or so. Finally, the original open access memo from 2011, its principles, and the policy documents that accompanied it were thoughtfully drafted, and they continue to offer guidance to us today. Thanks.
Wow, did we say fast? That was super fast. Great. Setting a high bar here. So next we have Merete Sanderhoff from the National Gallery of Denmark.
Hi, everybody. Thank you for having me on this panel. I come from Statens Museum for Kunst, the National Gallery in Denmark. We started working towards an open content policy in 2010-11, and in today we have a public domain dedication that says that what was in the public domain should stay in the public domain when digitized. The journey towards our open content policy as it is today was that we were able to do a pilot project in 2012 following a couple of years of internal discussions and a lot of research into the museum community that was working with open access. We started out using the Creative Commons attribution license on just 160 highlights from our collection in the wake of entering the Google Art Project, because those 160 highlights were the same that we provided to Google. And the argument internally for us was, if we're going to give away our high-resolution images to a private company for free, that they may use on any platform they want, then we cannot, as a public institution, keep charging the public for those same images. In 2014, we were able to change our policy to align it with the public domain concept based on really good experiences with the pilot project. So we wrote an overall public domain policy, changed CC BY to CC 0, and we have today released 25,000 images under CC 0. They are not in a beautiful, tailored kind of website like the rest of you represent. And I'll talk to you a little bit about that now. The internal pathway was to think big, start small, and move fast, inspired by our advisor, Michael Edson, from the Smithsonian, who has been a fantastic inspiration and support in all of our work towards open access. We were in a situation where we had to take a bottom-up approach. The incentive to work with open access came from staff in the organization working in digital curation and education, not from the management. But we were given permission to run with it, with this small pilot project of just 160 images. From the beginning, we had great support from our management to pursue openness, but there were, of course, also the obvious concerns of losing revenue and control over images. What helped us overcoming those obstacles? A lot of research and documentation of other players in this field and what they were experiencing, and the kinds of usages of their collections that were supported by open access. And I'd just like to take this opportunity to thank all of you for sharing your process in this and writing about it and publishing and being willing to put that into the world, because that has completely made us able to release our collections. That we were able to show to my management back in Denmark, NGA is doing this, Yale is doing this, Getty is doing this, so should we. Another thing that has been completely crucial is to have a continuous internal dialogue about these difficult concerns. This is not a decision that is taken overnight. It takes years and years and years of patient going back and forth over these arguments, showing this report and this result, and taking a decision, going back, having to talk to internal stakeholders again and again to convince them. Especially our photographers have had concerns about this, and it's a continuous strive to align everybody in the organization about this policy. Even though it's written down, it's not necessarily at the heart of everybody in the organization. So it takes time. And then getting the chance to run with a pilot project and show results of what this means in practice really proves the impact of open. And I have just 25 seconds left. With that, I'd like to show you something that I mentioned in a panel Thursday. One of the projects we have facilitated around our open images is creative reuse and remixing of the images to decorate a drug injection room in Copenhagen. I'd just like to show you a couple of images of that because I think it confused people. What's that all about? So this is the drug injection room, the Cloud it's called. This is what it looked like before, and when the young people, the art pilots from our museum, who are young volunteers who do community outreach project, they came in, then they started talking to the users of the Cloud, asking them, what would you like to see in this space that you have to use because you're addicted? And the result is that public domain collections can be used to recreate places and spaces that these drug users dream of. So these art pilots facilitate improved social conditions for the users. Just to show one small example of what it means to put public collections into the hands of the public, it can make a social difference. We're very proud of our art pilots. You can read much more about the entire process leading up to our open collections in Sharing is Caring, Openness and sharing in the cultural heritage sector, which is online at sharingiscaring.smk.dk. Free download, read it in various formats. And on my SlideShare account, there's much, much more documentation of all of our projects. Thank you.
Thank you, Merete. Next, we have Alan Newman from the National Gallery of Art in Washington. Wearing an awesome T-shirt, I must say.
So I believe in image licensing, and I bought this for $25. So. And where else can you get the icons of Memphis and Louisville together in the same shirt? It's very, as Merete said, reproductions of our collection are very healing, and it's really important that we follow this path together. For me, my strategy was to bring in Diane Zorich, because everyone listens to Diane Zorich.
Who, by way of shout out, is here in the room with us.
One of my favorite people. And Diane and I and our chief and deputy counsel worked together on a one-page policy, which is also open access. Many other folks that came after us have used parts of our policy. It's up on our site, and we're basically, we all have identical policies. Use our images for any purpose, and don't even tell us what you're doing, unless you want to. It's all mission driven. So a little history. The physicists, the scientists got together in the 70s and 80s, and they were paying, especially the grad students who didn't have any money, they were paying ridiculous amounts of money to journal publishers. So they all got together, first in Budapest, then in Bethesda, my home, and finally in Berlin, under the auspices of the Max Planck Institute, to basically say, in broad declaration, that they were endorsing open access at that time, which permitted them, everyone to read, download, copy. So they just started publishing their own and sharing, and this led eventually in our field to our icon of open access, Ken Hammer, in 2005, with his seminal essay, please read it if you get a chance, Public Domain, Art in the Age of Easier Mechanical Reproduction, where he says, among other things, that visual reproductions in the public domain and clearly removing all questions about their availability for use and reuse would likely cause no harm to the finances. Many good studies, especially Simon Tanner's study from Mellon, which actually proves the point that we lose money when we try to license. But it's ultimately it's not about money. It's about mission. And then further, after we launched, Ken said, time to rip, mix, and burn. One's left to wonder which of the country's great public collections will be last to understand and embrace the enormous potential for research, education, and creativity. So this is where we are. And we built the site compatible with our website wasn't ready at that point. So and we wanted to get this out. So we built the site with lots of added value to it. So we have a reproduction guide. We have a lot of technical stuff written for novices on the site, and it's pretty cool. So 2012 is when we launched. Since then, we've had 1.8 million. We repeat, 1.8 million downloads. Lots of eyeballs. And these are just the people downloading, not the teachers that are showing it to 40 people, et cetera. High quality, color accurate, ready for publication, along with a reproduction guide. So if you're an author collecting images, which the publishers, they throw that on the authors all the time, plus they tell the authors to go pay for the images, the author can hand our reproduction guide into the printer, and they can feel secure that they'll be reproduced properly. So many sharing tools. Today, more than 46,000 images up and constantly adding. 4,000 pixels on the long side. We make our paintings on this wonderful robotic controlled easel that can be 20 to 25,000 on the long side. And we'll give those away too, but we haven't figured out a way to get performance offering all of that, so they're available. And we have a cool light box that the teacher can send to the class and share whatever sets of images they want. And they can say, you can save your Monday Lightbox, Tuesday Lightbox, Wednesday, or whatever, give it whatever name. And recently we upgraded the site. We have a nice predictive search on key fields. We support mobile and tablet, image sharing to social, and very cool for a lot of people who don't like or don't even know how to get images into PowerPoint. You can just check off PowerPoint format or Keynote or open, whatever the open version of PowerPoint is, and it downloads to that. And looking ahead, a lot of talk this conference about open link data. Max Marmer was calling it open link dating, which I think Scott ran. We actually did that for here. And so these are predictive things. Open content is growing huge. I mean, many of us are publishing our backlists for free download of out-of-print publications. And my thought is, in 5 years, it's all going to be quaint. It's going to be very odd to find people that aren't doing it. I wanted to give a shout out to someone that was also very important in open access. I'm just ending with this, and that's Aaron Swartz. He was a prodigy, and as a teenager, he wrote RSS and Reddit, which are two great tools that many of us use. And his Guerrilla Open Access Manifesto is published in 2008, where he says information is power, but like all power, there are those who want to keep it for themselves. And he was harassed by the Massachusetts DA more than any other hacker has ever been. And this is a hacker with soul and with his heart in the right place. So, great film 2 years ago called The Internet's Own Boy, if you get a chance, see it.
Okay, thanks, Alan. I'll talk briefly about how our policy came to be. Kind of a big title for a really tiny talk there. So, the Davison Art Center, or DAC as I'll call it here, is part of Wesleyan University, and our collection of about 25,000 objects, chiefly prints and photographs, exists to serve Wesleyan's educational mission. The DAC Open Access Images Policy applies a no known copyright restriction statement to all suitable images of collection objects in the public domain, and we also share object metadata under a Creative Commons CC0 license. We published the policy and put it into use in 2012, and that was fortuitous local timing for us for two reasons. First, the broad idea of open access had been gaining visibility in non-museum contexts at the highest levels of the university. So that enabled our proposal, based on the collection's role as an educational resource, to tie in not only to core aspects of the DAC's mission and Wesleyan's mission, but also to that currently live topic, and just the phrase itself even. Second, the still fresh launch of open images at LACMA, the Los Angeles County Museum of Art, Yale, and the National Gallery, thank you, Melissa, thank you, Alan, gave us recent examples of similar moves at other museums. And this was both a sign, on the one hand, that providing open images was a emergent, growing practice in museums, and on the other, that the museum community was still in the early days of moving towards this, suggesting that we could pitch our move as something that would make Wesleyan an early mover and help encourage momentum towards easier access to images, not only from what by comparative standards to our tiny place are actually large places, even if by some other standards they're small to medium-sized museums, not only those larger ones. So I wrote a one-page strategy document, DAC Digital Images in an Age of Open Access, and framed in these ways, it sketched a course of action of directly providing open images and contributing them to aggregators as well. It was quickly approved up our university reporting chain, and we quickly began to act on it. So in that sense, the path was actually free of obstacles. There we are, for us. But two kinds of advanced work actually helped it be that way. First, one-on-one conversations within the DAC to explain its value to mission, to allay concern over loss of control, and to share the knowledge that lost licensing revenue would be truly illusory after factoring the staff time it takes to actually execute one-off permissions agreements. And second, an explicit, concise, strategic positioning document that was really targeted for university readers outside the scope of our museum operation itself. And in that sense, our nested institutional location had a lot to do with how this worked out. By first establishing buy-in within the museum in face-to-face conversational ways, and then gaining formal university approval by means of a one-page strategy document that tied in both to mission and to some concerns and the phrase open access, which had a certain kind of currency at higher levels in the university at that same time. And with that, Stanley from the Getty.
All right. Hello, everybody. You know, in the early part of the last century, if you wanted to buy a painting by Georgia O'Keeffe, you had to be interviewed by Alfred Stieglitz. And he was her gatekeeper. And I'll just say that I think in the past, museums have kind of had that role. We're the keepers of the sacred objects. And there were a lot of barriers for people to access scholarly material and images, and clearly that's changing. All these people on the panel have been really key in making those changes. But at the Getty, I'll again mention Ken Hama. He was an early advocate of this. He's also the guy that hired me at the Getty. So I have a lot of affection for him, and he was a tireless advocate for this. And it took almost 10 years for the Getty to kind of realize that really the main reason for doing open access is it's in alignment with the mission of the institution. And if any of your institutions are contemplating doing it, that's often something you can point to. I mean, at the Getty and in many mission statements for museums, there's something in there about dissemination of knowledge. And finally, in October of 2013, Jim Kuno made this statement that basically says, we're opening everything up. You can use these images to do whatever you want. So this directive came from the top finally. We really analyzed revenue, and I'll echo, it's useful to read Simon Tanner's paper. He really exhaustively looked at the revenue aspect. And we had some curatorial pushback. The notion of our images showing up on a coffee mug made a few curators uncomfortable. There were some obvious barriers. I mean, we needed to make sure that this was a process that was not manual. It would be automatic. So there were a lot of technical implementation issues. We really needed it to be automated. The other thing is we really needed to make sure that of all of the things in our collection, we needed to make sure that they were truly public domain. And the way we did that is the collection pages that we have are connected directly to TMS through a middle software layer. And so when images are put up on our collection pages, we automatically know whether there will be a download button there or not. But we also didn't want to have a separate portal for people, scholars, for example, who were requesting use of images that were restricted. So we needed to sort of build that all into one portal. How are we doing? In 2 years, we're approaching 500,000 downloads, which I think is kind of amazing. At launch, we really tried to put this up really quickly. We started with about 4,400 images, and coincidentally, they were the same set that we sent to the Google Art Project. Thank you, Peter. And but since then, I've added many, many more. Currently, we have about 87,000 images available. We've also started adding images from the Getty Research Institute. They have some spectacular special collections. They're adding more and more every day. The open content status, like I said before, is that flag is automatically set in TMS, and that travels through to our collection pages. So we're sure that those images are truly public domain. We originally started hosting this stuff on the cloud. Now it's internal on Getty servers, and upon export, tombstone metadata is embedded in the XMP of every file, and it's all automatic. So in the future, one thing we've done is on our collection page, we often have a lot of interpretive material. We have a tab for bibliography, a tab for provenance, and some of our more important works, we have a lot of information there. In the past, we really hadn't included that as part of open content. We're just now attaching a Creative Commons BY designation on all of that text. Right now, you have to cut and paste that, although we're considering automating that. So when you download, you can request to have a PDF of all of that interpretive information as a sidecar file. And we're again exploring ways to dynamically share with aggregators such as ArtStore and Google Cultural Institute as well. So who's using this stuff? Lots of people. We were talking earlier about ways to sort of discover what people are doing, how people are mashing some of this stuff up. But my favorite story was when we first launched this, my boss, Nick Honeyset, who many of you know, his next door neighbor was a movie producer, and he was producing this movie, American Hustle. And he frantically called Nick up and said, we're about to release the movie. We realized that we hadn't cleared rights on the paintings in a couple of these scenes. Do you know any place where? And Nick said, well, yes, we do. And so Nick pointed him to our open content thing. And he got this email after the film opened. You saved the film. We ended up using 4 paintings from the open content images. They were our last visual effects shots, finished on Friday. Last picture changes in the film. And that's our Rembrandt. So that's it for me. Great.
Hello. My story is really more about implementation. I'm afraid that all the work of all the leaders in this open access space previous to us have done all the philosophical work for us. It is just the right thing to do to provide this kind of thing. So there were a couple different factors that allowed us to implement this change. One was our previous online collection had been around for a handful of years, did not provide very good access to the imagery. And the images were actually kind of just a small piece of the works that you could see online. So we definitely wanted to do something to improve this. The max resolution of any image we could show was 600 by 600. So we wanted to provide open access the same way everyone else was. The other thing that allowed us to do this was moving to a new digital asset management system. Both these things were kind of happening at the same time in our institution. So, when we set out to find a new dam, one of the things that we wanted to do was incorporate all the metadata from our collection system into all the licensing data as well. So we had a large effort to clean up all of our imagery as we moved it into the new system. And that was largely headed up by our photography department and our manager of rights and reproduction. That included sending out new licensing agreements for all the works. A lot of the works in our collection are public domain. In fact, most of them are. So this was pretty easy for us. I'd say it was almost a cakewalk in comparison to what most other people experience. Part of this was bringing in an intern, an information science graduate student, to work specifically on this project, and instituting, a vocabulary that's standard in our institution. And once we moved everything over to this new dam in the course of a year, then we started working on the new online collection, where we're able to provide full-size downloads for any work in the public domain. And that literally means full size. If I have an image that's 35,000 pixels on one side, we will give it to you. And we will give you all the views we have in full resolution. For things that aren't in the public domain, where we can't allow you to download the images, we're still using tiling technology to allow you to see the fine details of the work online. So where it's not, open access in the traditional sense, it is at least open experience. When you do download our open access imagery, we do have a questionnaire that we have people fill out. If you say it's just for personal use, we don't ask you anything further, but if it's scholarly or commercial, we'll ask you a few more questions. These questions don't restrict access based on your answers, but we do track this information so that we can go back later and see who is using it and for what purposes. All that information gets pushed to Google Analytics in the same place that, all of our website usage is also there, so we can tie things together that way. And just as a summary, like I said, most of our works are in the public domain. That's 64% of them. So that's 2/3 of our collection you can download in its entirety. And this is multiple views of the object, so front and back, or different positional angles. We have 36,000 images, and 23,000 of those are in the public domain. And then that 3% that we don't allow you to zoom or have that open experience with the artwork, those are usually things that are very restricted, like ARS or VAGA. So as far as, I don't have a lot to say about the policy of it, because like I said, it's just, this is the right thing to do, right? The art of humanity belongs to humanity. That's all I have.
Right, and what a great statement to end the presentational piece of this on, right? So we still have a good amount of time, and at this point we can flip the focus around from the 6 places you've just heard about to how some of these ideas and policies and prospective policies play in your museums. And one of our aims in doing that is for whoever may be here who has been wanting to move in this direction, has been encountering some sort of internal struggle in doing so, to have a chance to hash that around with everyone who's here. I should say, as a reminder, this session, as are all MCN sessions, is being audio recorded. That has 2 implications here. Usually it only has 1. The easy one is mechanical. We have these microphones. I'll hand these off to Brian and Joseph. I'm not giving you guys a job, just your closest. So if and as you do say anything, if you can find one of those mics, that'll be great. It'll become part of the record. Which leads us to the other implication of audio recording here. Since, of course, the obstacles that arise in these intra-institutional moments can be politically fraught. Feel really, really free to pose your question as a hypothetical, if you wish. I mean, real details are great. They keep it real. But if you want, if your name isn't, well, I won't single anybody out. But, feel free to actually say that you're a person from a different museum. No, don't do that. Say your name is Eric Lance. No, I won't say that either. But seriously, feel free to keep it hypothetical if you wish, or to actually make it real if it feels comfortable to do that. What we really want to do is get various sorts of cases out in the air to think about them together. We'll see how long that takes us. If that fills up the rest of our time, great, because that is something that not so often has been the real focus of a session like this. But if we run out of that topic and still have some time, then it'll be great to open it up for any questions about specific aspects of policies, how big the images are, technical infrastructure, whatever people have questions about. So, to start, who here, show of hands, wishes that you could launch open images in your museum but hasn't yet been able to do it? All right, those of you with hands up, is there somebody who would like to tell us why it is that you haven't been able to help make this happen yet?
Since I have a microphone. I'm Brian Kennedy. I'm at the Science Museum of Minnesota. I'm happy to have that recorded. I think one reason is resources, but also because I'm curious if there are, I haven't seen as many examples, and I'm not as familiar with many examples of these policies and approaches in natural history collections, and also collections that overlap with NAGPRA, the Native American Graves Repatriation Act. And I was wondering if anybody has any other institutions that have examples from that area that might be more familiar to our collections folks beyond cultural institutions.
Yeah. Great, and let me insert one quick thing. Yeah, the fact that you raise NEGPRA and related factors, I think, is a key thing to surface here, because in the sorts of collections that we've been dealing with here, the main ethical frameworks around what we can push out more or less align with regimes of rights law, right? But of course, for certain kinds of collections that haven't really been core to what we've been talking about so far, there can be deep, equally, sometimes to my mind, even more important ethical frameworks of rights around that are culturally grounded outside the social context from which copyright came into being. And that's critical. So anyway, somebody wants to be concrete about that.
I'll start on that. For natural history collections, I really cannot imagine any rights issues. And so, to my mind, I would love to see more of that stuff out there. And it's important to note that NASA just released 25,000 high-resolution images from all of the moon stuff, which I think is fantastic. Someone's shaking their head over there.
That had been out in the public for a long time before that.
Really?
It's just a new thing, yeah.
Great. Well, I just discovered it and was thrilled, actually.
So at Yale, we have the Yale Peabody Museum, and so they are wrapped in under Yale's policy. But I will say they were already very open. Many of their projects for digitization were grant funded already and already had requirements that everything produced under those grants be open. So you can see a lot of the Peabody's material not only through Yale portals, but through like iDigBio and other projects like that. The other thing is that the Yale policy, if you go to our site and read through it, there are, it's very carefully written, and it addresses in there that there are instances where things are not subject to open access, and it would include issues like NAGPRA or other sensitivities, and that it also gave the individual museums and collections at Yale some ability to make those decisions at their discretion, so that we could be more open with everything else, knowing that when there were things that we had to be more sensitive about, we had the ability to do that too.
So I'm going to ask Diane Zorch to follow up with me, but Gunter Weibel and Mike Edson have been very active in promoting open access in the Smithsonian museums. The previous secretary, I don't think, wanted to do it uniformly without everyone unanimously agreeing to it, and they kind of left it up to each individual. So I think there are a few museums that some in the science area that allow this now. Is that true, Diane, or no?
Lots of complications. There are just so many more complications than in the art museum field, I think. You have privacy rights issues, which are huge with, for example, Native American collections, which often are in natural history museums. You have also privacy rights or concerns about fossil material and archaeological material. If you give up this is metadata actually more than images. If you give up the coordinates, there are lots of unsavory types out there who will use them to dig things up and sell them. So there's just a host of more complicated issues. So like Melissa said, many of these places do have as open an access of policy as they can, but they have to allow for individual discretion based upon the particular specimen or object. And I really can't speak for the Smithsonian officially, but I can say they face the same issues, and probably exponentially more, because they have 19 repositories, museums, including a zoo, and gosh, living collections have their own problems, and I don't mean human collections, I mean non-human collections. The medical records of animals in zoos are highly proprietary. So, things you don't think about, but natural history museums really do have to think about.
I'd just like to mention the Natural History Museum in Aarhus, Denmark. They did a digitization project of natural history specimens like insects and plants and so on, and opened up those digitized materials for free use, because it was a preservation factor, that it was actually very delicate specimens to send around to researchers all over the world that would destroy the original specimens. So the digitization and opening of this really furthered the research worldwide.
Yes.
Deb Wythe from the Brooklyn Museum. I'm one of the big elephants in the room, I think, is staff and staff restructuring. What happens to rights and reproduction staff when open access comes into effect? Are their jobs restructured? What do they end up doing? I mean, one of the things we've all seen too, the opposite of open access, is museums actually outsourcing rights and reproductions to places like Art Resource and complete staffs being wiped out. So curious.
So we had one fellow who retired, and we didn't replace him because we didn't need to. But some of the other folks who were less than fully tasked, they are working full bore providing personalized customer service, basically on picture research. So that was a good transition.
For our part, we sort of doubled more efforts toward the actual digitization and making more things available. So we kind of redistributed staff duties. So while we had less requests coming in, then we put attentions toward getting more material out there for everyone.
Jim Mays at the Walters Art Museum, and we've been had open access for a while. But to address your questions, one of the things we did is we took our rights. We're a small institution. We had one rights and reproduction person, and we moved that person into administrating our dams. So that person now does internal training, thinks about metadata, and we have not been able to work through automating the requests for our images. We are a smaller institution. We don't have the same levels of demand that some of the speakers institutions have, so we will still take requests, and we will still manually fulfill those, but there isn't tracking invoices. There isn't all those things that people talk about that show, that Simon Tanner's paper showed that really make this not really such a money gainer. And one other thing I just wanted to say while I have the microphone is that our first open access project came about in 2008, and it was. It was kind of on the sly. It was a curator of our manuscripts collection who wrote a grant to the NEH, and as part of his grant to digitize the manuscripts, he wrote into the grant proposal that all the images would be made freely available without any restrictions on them. And I don't think anyone in the administration read the grant or understood the grant. So what happened is that as we started producing the manuscripts and they started being used, he started putting images out on Flickr. He started to do all sorts of things with things, and two things happened. One is there was more attention directed to the museum than had been in the past. But the second thing is the sky didn't fall in. It allowed the administration to see that this isn't such a horrible thing. And so. I don't know if I want to recommend that approach, but it got us on the road.
Can I follow just for a moment? The truth is nothing bad happens.
Yeah.
There's only goodwill. Trust us. Just in terms of strategy, what we did is we did a Google image search for our iconic painting. It was a Da Vinci painting. We got about 50,000 results. And the National Gallery was on the 8th page, 500 down the road. And of course, Wikipedia is first, and then there were a bunch of people selling posters. And all the images looked like junk. So what I did is I sat down, starting with our director, in groups of 3 until I saw 250 people on our staff, and I just showed them that. It took a minute. I said, this is what's going on now. If we continue doing what we're doing and locking things up, it's going to proliferate even more because people can't get access. You know, a fifth grade kid writing a term paper has got to do 20 faxes to get an image. So there wasn't one person that said, let's do this, let's do this.
Yeah, and I'd say in many contexts, that kind of face-to-face, one or two or three people just sitting there talking about it, looking at something, can be so critical before anything that looks like a formal proposal to do something. Because then they understand before they see the proposal.
Yeah, something you said is really interesting, is for smaller institutions, Flickr is an option.
Yeah.
That's open content. Yeah.
One of the things we've been doing in Denmark is to encourage our colleague institutions to follow the example of the National Gallery and adopt the CC0 public domain dedication. And one of the museums that is doing that in a not standard way is a small museum called the Hirschsprung Collection. And they have a really old, crappy website. They can't afford to provide download from it. They don't have the dams. It's really technically difficult. But they have talked to our local Wikimedia chapter, and Wikimedia is helping them put their high-resolution images up on Wikimedia, put the right metadata up, and then they're providing access to their collection via Wikimedia, enabling Wikipedians to write articles using these images, which will make their collections more known. And this is an absolutely viable way to create open access without all the technical development.
Yeah, great. Since we have a great number of hands up and somewhat limited time, let me ask first if anybody who is interested in talking at the moment has a specific question about a specific scenario with obstacles that you'd like to think through. Good, we have two. Let's start up here.
Okay, is this on? Yeah. So Eric Landsberg from MoMA, and we're in quite a different situation from, I think, most of the panelists and maybe most people in the room, which is that the largest part of our collection are works under copyright. So while I would love to be able to offer open access, it becomes a very difficult conversation around my museum for very good reasons, right? So I'm interested in any ideas other people might have about how to expose the collection, making it accessible, even if that doesn't necessarily mean free download of images. And the most recent step we've taken in that direction is wherever there were not restrictions, we've increased the size of the image on our own website from 600 pixels to about 2,500 pixels. That was great. Obviously, some artists and some agencies are not going to be willing to let us do that. We've taken that step. And the other step we've taken is to make all of our collections information available on GitHub. So it's a kind of open access, although it's not open access necessarily to the images. So I'd be interested, in the interest of time, I'd be interested to continue maybe outside this room with any ideas that other museums might have whose collection is perhaps, I don't know, maybe we're 80% under copyright.
And quick 10-second interjection. Thank you, Ellen Newman, who has a plane to catch. Back to Eric.
No, that's it. I just wanted to throw that situation out there just to open up discussion. I see John has a comment.
How about if MoMA makes their images at least available for free when they're requested? When we request image rights for reproduction and such, you still have to pay a fee.
That's right. You do. You're saying for scholarly publishing in particular, right? That's been under discussion, although there's still, that leads into the question, I think, of the CAA fair use guidelines. I think there's a session coming up a little bit later today.
Yes, right after.
And I'm very interested in that session because I think that might give me something I can bring back to my museum. Yeah, I totally get it.
Great. Anything else on Eric's point?
Yeah, I'd actually like to make a point. You do have stuff that's out of copyright.
Yes. Yes, of course we do.
I'd just like to point to a project then in the Netherlands. The Netherlands Sound and Vision has a huge audiovisual collection that is mostly under copyright, but they took this tiny fraction that is out of copyright and put it up on Wikimedia, and they have seen gigantic reuse of that tiny fraction of their collection. And just to go back to, think big, start small, that you can have enormous impact with a very small sample.
Yeah, great. And I think without fail, all of the instances represented up here, and the other ones I can think of in the field, they've all phased in, whether it's due to production side limitations in capture or rights, or typically some mix of those and technical infrastructure for delivery. Find a few things, push them out. One thing that I've said before is find even one image. Make it the one.
Starry Night, anybody?
Right. Find one great image of one great work that you know is clear of third-party rights, and put it out there. And then you've done it, and then you can add more. But you've made the point, in a sense, and you've committed in a certain public-facing way, which is important.
And time is on our side.
Yes.
Right. Are you out of time? I can ask this later. Do you want me to ask
Oh,
now?
yeah, please go. Yes.
I'm Janet Stroll-Morgan from the Princeton University Art Museum, and we do have our images open access, but and I also agree with the authority, if your image is out there, the authority image is out there. My question is, we have it open for educational and personal use, but not for commercial use. And how do you make that switch? We still have people go to Art Resource for commercial uses. And what made you guys make the decision to have it all open?
Merete?
Again, Wikipedia. Because Wikipedia is an open encyclopedia, so they cannot reuse images that has a non-commercial clause. And that was actually the most important factor for us in adopting a license that allows commercial reuse. Also, we're the National Gallery, we're tax funded. The underlying artworks are in the public domain, they belong to the public. That means also for creative and innovative reuse.
Great, and this is a wonderful conversation. I wish we could keep going, but there is another session coming up very soon in here. I don't want to cheat them of setup time. So let me thank you all for coming, all of our speakers, except for Alan, who we already thanked because he's in Uber headed to the airport. Thank you all.